In the early years of the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed the ocean was their domain, a vast shield of salt water surrounding an empire that stretched from Manchuria to the Marshall Islands. The Japanese fleet, the Kaigun, was built upon the doctrine of decisive battle, a single grand engagement that would crush any enemy daring to approach the home islands. Submarines were never meant to wage economic war. Unlike the Germans, whose U-boats prowled trade routes to strangle Britain's supply lines, Japan saw submarines as extensions of its surface fleet, scouts for the mighty battleships of the combined fleet. Their role was reconnaissance, interception, and support, not attrition. The early I-class submarines, especially the Type B and Type C variants, were technological marvels by pre-war standards, measuring over 350 feet in length, capable of crossing entire oceans. They carried reconnaissance seaplanes, torpedoes, and even cargo bays for secret missions. Japan built them not as raiders but as instruments of strategy, eyes of the empire beneath the waves. In 1941 and 1942, these submarines achieved early success. They shadowed U.S. carriers, scouted Pearl Harbor's aftermath, and sank Allied warships across the Pacific. The ocean then seemed infinite, an ally of concealment. But by 1943, that illusion began to dissolve. American industry, vast, relentless, and increasingly scientific, had begun transforming the undersea battlefield. Every lost ship became a lesson. Every attack a data point. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, working alongside the Navy's experimental labs, began investing heavily in anti-submarine warfare, ASW, a field once considered secondary. The first breakthroughs came not from new weapons, but from sound. British research on ASDIC, an early form of sonar, had shown that underwater echoes could reveal hidden targets. The Americans refined it, making the devices smaller, more accurate, and deployable across destroyers, corvettes, and even aircraft. The ocean's silence, once the submarine's greatest ally, was now being invaded by waves of sound. Then came radar, a weapon of light rather than noise, mounted on long-range patrol aircraft like the PBY Catalina, and later the Ventura and Liberator. Radar allowed the Allies to detect surface submarines even at night. The Japanese captains, who once surfaced under the stars to recharge batteries and breathe fresh air, found themselves hunted by invisible machines scanning the skies. By the end of 1943, Japan's submarines were losing more men than they were sinking ships. The numbers told the story. In that year alone, the Imperial Navy lost over a dozen I-class subs to U.S. air and sea patrols, yet the Japanese command held to its old doctrine that submarines should assist fleet actions, not attack merchant lines. It was a fatal rigidity. The Americans, meanwhile, had adapted. Their submarines, smaller, faster, and more autonomous, were sinking Japan's merchant fleet with ruthless efficiency. Still, the Pacific was vast, and Japan's crews believed there were places the Americans could not reach: deep trenches, silent currents, and uncharted expanses of blue. That faith kept them sailing. But in early 1944, something changed. American scientists introduced a new tool, a weapon not meant to destroy, but to listen. They called it the sonobuoy, a small floating cylinder dropped from patrol planes. It could transmit underwater sound through radio waves to the aircraft above. For the first time, the Allies could listen to submarines from the air, track their movement, record their propellers, and predict their escape routes in real time. It was invisible, nearly silent, and devastatingly effective. By the time the Japanese understood what was happening, the technology had already matured. What once felt like the infinite ocean had become a network, monitored, measured, mapped, and in that network, Japan's submarines were ghosts already fading. The Americans were not just hunting submarines. They were rewriting the rules of the ocean itself. Would you like me to continue to Section 2 of Context, covering the technological race of 1944, the rise of hunter-killer tactics, and how Japan's undersea world began to collapse? By mid-1944, the Pacific was no longer a sanctuary. It was a grid, a living map of sound, light, and data. The United States Navy had reached a new phase in anti-submarine warfare. Their approach was no longer reactionary. It was predictive. Every submarine contact, every intercepted signal, Every confirmed sinking was fed into a growing intelligence network spanning Pearl Harbor, Guam, and the Australian bases at Brisbane and Fremantle. The U.S. Navy's technological arm, working with scientists from Bell Labs and the Naval Research Laboratory, refined this new discipline with one goal: to make the ocean transparent. This was the birth of acoustic warfare. In 1944, the Allies deployed thousands of radio sonobuoys across the Pacific. These devices, small, expendable, and astonishingly effective, were equipped with hydrophones capable of picking up even faint underwater vibrations. Dropped by aircraft, each buoy would extend a thin cable into the water, capturing the sounds of submarine propellers, torpedoes, or ballast tanks, and transmitting them via radio to receivers on patrol planes. The sky had become the ocean's new predator. Aircraft, like the Lockheed PV-1 Ventura, Consolidated B-24 Liberator, and the powerful Grumman Avenger were now outfitted with sonobuoy receivers, radar, and depth charges. These planes operated in teams, sweeping vast sectors of sea in search patterns designed through intelligence data, often guided by decrypted Japanese communications from MAGIC, the Allied code-breaking program. Meanwhile, the once proud Japanese submarine force was shrinking at a catastrophic rate. By late 1944, fewer than 50 operational submarines remained out of the nearly 180 that had served since the start of the war. Many were trapped in shallow waters, unable to dive deep enough to evade the Americans' expanding reach. The Imperial Japanese Navy tried to adapt. Engineers attempted to design quieter propellers and new evasion tactics, but resources were dwindling. The industrial cities of Japan were under constant bombing. Fuel supplies were collapsing. Even training new crews became nearly impossible. Many of the young men sent to sea in 1944 had less than 6 months of operational experience. At sea, morale sank as low as the ocean itself. Submarine commanders once carried themselves as elite, silent warriors in steel coffins. Now each dive felt like a descent into inevitability. The Americans, on the other hand, were perfecting the coordination between sonar, radar, and magnetic anomaly detection, MAD, a revolutionary trio of technologies that made escape nearly impossible. The MAD system, mounted in aircraft tails, detected subtle disturbances in Earth's magnetic field caused by large metal objects, like submarines, beneath the surface. Even when a Japanese sub ran silent and deep, its mere presence could betray it. Hunter-killer groups, specialized teams of destroyers and aircraft, now patrolled key maritime choke points like the Philippine Sea, the Marianas, and the South China Sea. Japanese submarines that once prowled these waters were now the hunted, not the hunters. By the time the U.S. retook the Philippines in late 1944, Japan's entire submarine strategy had unraveled. Their missions had become desperate. Cargo runs to Southeast Asia, evacuation attempts or diplomatic transport to Germany, such as the ill-fated I-52. Yet even as defeat closed in, Japanese commanders clung to the illusion of stealth. They did not fully comprehend the magnitude of the enemy's acoustic reach. That aircraft could now drop hundreds of sonobuoys, forming temporary underwater nets that heard everything. When the I-52 departed Kure in March 1944, her orders were to cross the Indian Ocean and rendezvous with a German U-boat off the coast of Africa. The mission symbolized Japan's hope in alliance and secrecy, but by then, American intelligence had already intercepted her communications. The sea was no longer her ally, it was a trap. The battle that would follow would mark a turning point, a moment when the silence of the deep was broken forever. And in that moment, Japan's submarine crews would realize a truth no one had dared to say aloud. Their war beneath the waves was already lost. Inside the narrow, steel corridors of an I-class submarine, fear had become a constant companion. The men lived in darkness, sharing every breath, every heartbeat. For weeks at a time, they were confined in a vessel barely larger than a building's hallway. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, sweltering when the engines ran, frigid when the sea chilled the hull. Fresh air was rationed, water recycled, and food, often tinned or preserved, became tasteless sustenance for the body and mind. Before 1944, a Japanese submariner took pride in his isolation. The deep sea offered a strange freedom. an invisibility that made the ocean their own. Each successful mission reinforced a silent confidence. They could evade, they could survive. They were hunters, not the hunted. But the arrival of sonar buoys changed everything. Every ping was an echo of inevitability. Crews began to whisper of invisible hunters above, machines that could detect their movement even when submerged. Sleep became a luxury few allowed themselves. Exhaustion gnawed at the edges of discipline. Officers like Commander Uno Cameo had to balance maintaining morale with the crushing reality of technological inferiority. One wrong decision, a surfaced engine run, a misjudged dive, could expose the entire crew to destruction. Letters home became rare. Some men wrote, knowing they might never send them. Some refused, unable to reconcile the beauty of the ocean they had once called home with the machinery that now stalked them. Human endurance was tested not just by depth charges but by psychological warfare. Fear had entered the hull as surely as water had once entered during test dives. The Japanese submariners weren't imagining things. The ocean itself had changed. For the first time in naval history, sound became a battlefield. American engineers had perfected the sonobuoy, a small, cylindrical device that could be dropped from aircraft, float on the surface, and extend a hydrophone into the water. Each buoy transmitted the faint vibrations of a submarine's propellers, ballast systems, or even hull flexing back to the plane above. Multiple buoys could be deployed in a pattern, creating an invisible net that mapped the submarine's every movement. The technology was deceptively simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. Traditional anti-submarine tactics relied on depth charges dropped where sonar indicated approximate positions. Now aircraft could triangulate exact locations before an attack even began. The sonar network meant that submarines could no longer simply run silent and deep. Their presence was broadcast through the water, their movements measured in real time. This technological leap transformed the hunter-prey relationship. Submarines that had once approached convoys with near impunity were now carefully tracked. Even experienced captains were forced to rethink every maneuver. Some attempted radical evasive techniques, circling in tight loops, running at unusual depths, or shutting down engines entirely. But these were only temporary solutions. The U.S. Navy integrated sonobuoys with radar and magnetic anomaly detectors, MAD, to create a multi-layered approach. Radar could detect a submarine surfaced at night. Sonobuoys could track submerged movement. MAD could reveal hulls through magnetic disturbance. The net was nearly unbreakable. In many ways, the technology was not just mechanical. It was psychological. Japanese crews began to dread every sonar ping, every shadow on the hydrophone dial. It was a sound they could not fight, only hope to avoid. And hope, under these conditions, became as scarce as oxygen in a flooded compartment. These human and technological factors intertwined. Fear drove mistakes, and mistakes could be detected instantly by the Allies' acoustic web. Even the bravest submariners found themselves trapped in a reality where their skills, courage, and intuition could not overcome the relentless logic of sound and calculation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the full consequences of this new underwater war, in a moment when the ocean itself would turn against those who had once ruled it. By 1944, the Pacific had become a chessboard, and the pieces were no longer just ships and submarines, but machines and networks. The U.S. Navy had shifted from defensive patrols to aggressive hunter-killer groups, task forces designed to seek, track, and destroy enemy submarines before they could strike. These groups typically combined escort carriers, destroyers, and patrol aircraft, operating with seamless coordination. Aircraft equipped with radar and sonobuoy receivers scoured the ocean in tight, calculated search patterns. Destroyers moved beneath them, ready to strike at a detected position with depth charges or hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. The tactic was brutal in its efficiency. Submarines that once slipped past convoys undetected were now funneled into kill zones. Even experienced Japanese captains learned that evasion required more than skill. It demanded luck, and luck was increasingly in short supply. The sinking of I-52, Japan's large cargo submarine traveling to Germany, became a textbook example. U.S. forces intercepted communications, predicted the route, and laid a network of sonar buoys across the expected path. Aircraft detected and relayed positions to destroyers, coordinating strikes over several hours. The outcome was decisive. one of Japan's most advanced submarines, with high-ranking officers and critical cargo, was destroyed before reaching open waters. Intelligence had become as important as steel and torpedoes. Both sides relied on intercepted communications, code-breaking, and counterintelligence. By 1944, Allied codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had penetrated many Japanese naval ciphers. They could anticipate patrols, decode orders, and sometimes predict rendezvous points. Japanese submarines, for their part, had limited understanding of the Allies' reach. They occasionally intercepted American transmissions but misjudged the coordination between aircraft, buoys, and destroyers. The ocean that once offered anonymity now contained invisible surveillance, a digital net before the digital age. Even when submarines attempted to maintain radio silence, signals from other operations could betray their presence. Japanese commanders learned, sometimes too late, that intelligence warfare was no longer abstract. It could decide life or death beneath the waves. The human cost of this technological and tactical revolution was profound. Submarine crews faced a stark moral reality. Every mission risked total annihilation. Many sailors struggled to reconcile their duty to the Emperor with the growing certainty that their survival was unlikely. For officers, every order carried a moral burden. Sending men into waters saturated with sonobuoys and aircraft meant knowingly exposing them to death. Decisions once dictated by strategy now required confronting the inevitability of loss. Morale, once anchored in pride and purpose, became fragile. The wider Japanese military culture amplified this tension. Honor, sacrifice, and loyalty were inseparable from duty. Surrender was dishonorable, yet continued combat often guaranteed death. Crews experienced an ethical paradox. Obey the mission, preserve honor, or attempt escape and risk disgrace. Many reconciled it with stoicism, but others fell silent, carrying fear that could not be shared. In combination, these angles, tactical, intelligence, and moral, revealed the full spectrum of the submarine war's transformation. What had begun as a strategic extension of fleet doctrine became a human and technological crucible. Japanese crews were no longer masters of the deep. Every decision was scrutinized by the invisible network above, every movement tracked, every mistake amplified by the ocean itself. The silent war beneath the waves had become a theater where courage alone could not guarantee survival. The stage was set for a climactic confrontation. One mission, one route, one miscalculation would demonstrate the full weight of America's underwater supremacy and cement the reality that Japan's oceans had been lost. March 1944. The Western Indian Ocean, the I-52, one of Japan's largest and most advanced submarines, slipped beneath the waves at Kure Naval Base. She was a Type C cargo submarine, designed to carry not just torpedoes but critical materials for Germany: gold, strategic metals, and blueprints for advanced weaponry. Her mission was audacious, a voyage across 12,000 miles of hostile ocean to meet a German U-boat off the African coast. Commander Camillo and his officers believed the vastness of the Pacific would shield them, but unbeknownst to them, the Allies had already rewritten the rules of the deep. Sonobuoys, radar, and signals intelligence had converged to create an invisible net. The I-52's every movement was anticipated. As the submarine cruised silently at 16 knots beneath the dark waves, the first sonobuoys dropped from a PV-1 Ventura began their work. Their hydrophones captured the faint hum of the I-52's propellers. The aircraft transmitted the signals in real time to the destroyer, USS Barker, cruising hundreds of miles away. The crew of I-52, unaware of the exact threat, felt the subtle tension that had become routine. The ocean no longer offered anonymity. Every sound, every movement could betray them. Camillo ordered careful navigation through deep trenches, hoping to exploit topography for concealment. Yet the buoys formed a virtual grid, invisible but unyielding. By nightfall, aircraft patrolling above triangulated the submarine's position with unprecedented precision. They reported coordinates to waiting destroyers. The I-52 attempted evasive maneuvers, deep dives, zigzagging courses, sudden engine shutdowns, but the network of detection devices was too complete. The first attack came as a depth charge pattern from the destroyer, USS Barker. Explosions rocked the water, sending tremors through the steel hull. Crew members were thrown from bunks. Lights flickered as compartments groaned under pressure. For hours, the submarine endured repeated attacks, each wave of depth charges calibrated to anticipated movement detected by sonobuoys. At the same time, the aircraft above circled, dropping sonobuoys in new patterns, listening for any acoustic signature that might betray a shift in depth or course. The I-52 was trapped in a three-dimensional cage of sound, compressed by calculation, intelligence, and mechanical precision. Camille realized the gravity of the situation. The convoying U-boats and destroyers the mission had relied upon were nowhere in position, a miscommunication exacerbated by Allied code breaking. Every attempt to signal German counterparts risked interception. The crew faced a cold reality. There would be no rescue, no diversion, no chance to outrun the invisible enemy. By early March 24th, the final encounter came. Aircraft directed destroyers to drop an optimized depth charge pattern directly above the submarine. The hull shuddered violently, torpedoes shifted in their racks, and bulkheads began to buckle. The once confident men, trained for stealth and endurance, now fought for their very lives against a technology they could neither see nor counter. The submarine's final transmissions, brief, garbled, almost unintelligible, were intercepted by Allied intelligence. They revealed only location and partial acknowledgement of attack. Soon after, the I-52 slipped beneath the waves for the last time, a steel coffin swallowed by the ocean she had once ruled. The sinking was more than a tactical victory. It was symbolic. For the first time, Japan's submarine crews understood the reality of their situation. The ocean was no longer an ally. It was mapped, monitored, and dominated by an invisible network that anticipated every move. A network they could not fight and could not hide from. The loss of I-52 shocked the Imperial Navy. It was not just a ship, but a mission, a lifeline to an ally, a hope for the continuation of strategic exchange, a testament to Japan's undersea prowess. And all of it had been neutralized by technology, coordination, and intelligence. For the men in the surviving submarines, a chilling clarity emerged. Survival depended not on courage, skill, or audacity alone, but on a technology and reach they could not match. The ocean, their once infinite hunting ground, had become a theater of inevitable death. Following the loss of I-52, the Imperial Japanese Navy confronted a harsh, undeniable reality. The undersea war had shifted irreversibly. The ocean was no longer a silent refuge, but a vast, mapped battlefield under Allied control. Other Japanese submarines, scattered across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, now faced the full implementation of American hunter-killer doctrine. Aircraft equipped with radar and sonobuoys prowled the skies, while destroyers and frigates patrolled predictable transit lanes. Triangulation of submarine movements had become routine, and escape routes once considered safe were now monitored relentlessly. In late 1944, multiple Type C and Type B submarines attempting high-value cargo runs or evacuation missions were intercepted. The I-26, carrying personnel and supplies to the Philippines, was detected via combined sonar and aerial surveillance and sunk with near-total loss of life. Similar fates befell I-177 and I-36, demonstrating that the Allies' networked approach was not an anomaly, but a systemic dominance. Japanese commanders realized the ocean itself was compromised. Tactical doctrines that had been written years earlier, emphasizing fleet reconnaissance, opportunistic attacks, and isolated stealth missions, were now obsolete. Even the most experienced captains found themselves constrained, forced into defensive maneuvers against an enemy whose detection methods were invisible yet comprehensive. The sinking of I-52 sent shockwaves through the fleet. Officer reports emphasized confusion and disbelief. Many crews had previously relied on sound discipline and operational cunning to avoid detection. Now even perfect silence could not guarantee survival. Sonobuoys transmitted the mechanical heartbeat of every submarine, while aircraft circling above could coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles. The psychological impact was profound. Fear of detection became a constant companion, eroding morale and operational confidence. Strategically, the loss marked a turning point. Japan's ability to sustain long-distance submarine operations effectively ended. Critical cargo missions, from transporting rare metals to intelligence materials for Germany, became near impossible. Supply lines to the South Pacific and Southeast Asia were increasingly perilous, contributing to shortages that would cripple Japan's war effort in the final months. In parallel, the Allies refined their coordination. Hunter-killer groups combining intelligence, sonar, radar, and aircraft were deployed not just reactively but preemptively. They positioned themselves along expected Japanese transit routes, creating acoustic corridors, where submarines would be detected the instant they entered. Even submarines attempting unconventional routes could not escape the increasingly dense network of buoys, patrols, and intelligence predictions. The broader impact extended beyond the immediate theater. News of the I-52's sinking reached Tokyo via encrypted channels. Naval staff confronted evidence that their undersea fleet, once the pride of the empire, was now impotent against a technologically superior adversary. The ocean, previously an extension of Japanese strategic depth, had become a transparent, deadly space. For the men still at sea, the psychological shift was palpable. Once confidence in stealth allowed daring patrols, long voyages, and calculated risks. Now each dive, each surfaced engine run, each course correction carried a life or death weight. Crews operated in heightened tension, knowing that an invisible web of detection could collapse at any moment. Even seasoned submariners admitted in post-war accounts that the ocean felt different, no longer familiar, no longer forgiving. The loss of I-52 and the subsequent string of sinkings effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct strategic undersea operations. Remaining submarines were relegated to coastal defense, reconnaissance, or near-suicidal supply missions to isolated garrisons. The balance of power had shifted decisively. In those final months, the Japanese submarine force, once a symbol of technological ingenuity and naval skill, became emblematic of a broader truth in modern warfare. Technological adaptation could render even the most disciplined and skilled forces obsolete. The silent hunters of the deep were now hunted, measured, and mapped by instruments they could neither see nor counter. As March 1945 approached, Japan's undersea campaign had collapsed. The ocean that had once been a vast arena for daring and strategy had become an open, lethal space. The Allies had transformed silence into surveillance, invisibility into predictability, and the very water beneath the waves into a theater of inevitable defeat. And for the crews still aboard their submarines, one unshakable realization remained. The war beneath the waves was over. The ocean, once theirs, had passed into enemy hands. By mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. From a peak of nearly 180 operational boats at the start of the war, fewer than 40 remained capable of sustained missions. Losses were staggering. Submarines like I-52, I-26, I-177, and I-36 had been destroyed with almost total loss of life. The remaining fleet was scattered, aging, and increasingly confined to coastal waters or desperate supply runs to isolated garrisons. The human toll was immense. Each sunken submarine represented the loss of dozens of trained crewmen, men who had endured months of confinement, scarcity, and the ever-present fear of detection. Post-war accounts describe the psychological strain of prolonged patrols under constant surveillance, a combination of exhaustion, anxiety, and helplessness. The relentless pings of sonobuoys, once faint and puzzling, had become the unmistakable drumbeat of doom. Strategically, the collapse of Japan's undersea operations had far-reaching consequences. Japanese logistics had depended heavily on submarines to transport essential materials across the Pacific and to Europe. The loss of these vessels cut critical supply lines, exacerbating shortages of fuel, metals, and military equipment. For example, the I-52 had carried cargo vital to the German war effort. Its sinking not only deprived Japan of its safe passage, but also signaled to the Axis powers that Japanese submarine missions were no longer secure. Technologically, the war demonstrated the decisive power of innovation. Sonobuoys, magnetic anomaly detectors, and radar-equipped aircraft had shifted the balance of the Pacific. The Allies' ability to detect and intercept Japanese submarines highlighted the limits of traditional stealth and emphasized the growing role of integrated intelligence and coordinated attacks. For Japan, the lesson was painful and immediate. Superior engineering alone could not counter an opponent who combined technology, strategy, and information in perfect harmony. The Allied undersea dominance also freed surface and air forces to focus on offensive operations with fewer threats from beneath the waves. Convoys moved with increased security, amphibious landings faced less risk of submarine attack, and the pressure on Japan's remaining fleet intensified. The collapse of submarine operations contributed directly to the larger Allied strategy of isolating Japanese garrisons, cutting off supply chains, and hastening the end of the war in the Pacific. Yet beyond the statistics and strategy lay a quieter human truth. For the surviving Japanese submariners, the ocean itself had transformed from a familiar protective environment into a hostile, surveilled expanse. The intimacy and control they once felt over the deep sea had vanished. For many, the war beneath the waves had become less a contest of skill than a test of endurance against forces they could neither see nor resist. The sinking of the I-52 and other submarines was more than a tactical victory for the Allies. It symbolized a shift in naval warfare. It underscored the arrival of the technological age, where victory depended as much on data, detection, and coordination as on courage, training, or brute force. The Japanese Navy had been a pioneer in submarine engineering, but it was unprepared for a conflict where silence itself could be penetrated and every movement anticipated. The ocean, once Japan's ally and shield, had become a weapon in Allied hands. Its depths were no longer spaces of concealment but arenas of relentless observation. The crews who survived would carry this understanding with them. That mastery of the sea was no longer measured solely in steel and torpedoes, but in the invisible, unyielding eyes of technology. The collapse of Japan's submarine campaign had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical losses. The Pacific, once a theater of vast uncertainty and opportunity, had been transformed into a controlled environment. The Allies' combination of sonar, radar, sonobuoys, and intelligence networks effectively erased the advantage of stealth that had defined submarine warfare for decades. Japanese naval officers, who had trained for audacious long-range missions, now faced the sobering reality that even the most cautious operation could end in destruction. Japan's inability to maintain secure undersea lines of communication accelerated the decline of its broader war effort. Supply convoys, troop movements, and strategic resource transfers increasingly depended on surface ships, which were vulnerable to Allied air and naval attacks. Strategic isolation became a growing challenge. Fuel shortages, munitions scarcity, and the loss of critical industrial materials compounded the effects of the submarine failures, hastening Japan's eventual collapse in 1945. Post-war assessments revealed the depth of Allied dominance. Analysts noted that sonobuoy deployment, integrated with air patrols and destroyer coordination, had created a near-perfect detection network. This acoustic grid represented a paradigm shift in naval warfare. It demonstrated that technology, when combined with intelligence and strategy, could neutralize even the most sophisticated adversaries. For Japan, the lesson was stark. Traditional doctrines of stealth, courage, and tactical ingenuity could be rendered obsolete by rapid innovation. The implications resonated far into the Cold War era. The Allies' successes in sonar warfare informed post-war submarine design and anti-submarine doctrine worldwide. Sonobuoys, magnetic anomaly detectors, and coordinated air-sea hunting tactics became staples of modern navies, shaping the strategies of the United States, the Soviet Union, and other maritime powers. Japan, meanwhile, reflected deeply on the limitations of its pre-war doctrines. When the country eventually rebuilt its naval forces in the post-war period, emphasis shifted toward defensive patrols, reconnaissance, and anti-submarine capabilities rather than long-range offensive missions. On a human level, the survivors of Japan's submarine force carried an enduring mark of experience. Those who returned to port after months at sea spoke of an ocean transformed, no longer a silent companion but a hostile theater under constant surveillance. The psychological imprint of being hunted by unseen forces endured long after the guns fell silent. Veterans recounted the constant tension of listening to sonar pings, the exhaustion of endless vigilance, and the quiet despair of knowing the sea itself could betray them. The I-52's loss, along with other submarines, thus became both a literal and symbolic endpoint. It represented the death of Japan's undersea offensive capability, the triumph of technological adaptation, and the emergence of a new era in naval warfare. The silent hunters, once masters of the deep, were now emblematic of the vulnerability of even the most disciplined and skilled forces when confronted by superior technology. By 1945, Japan's submarine fleet was no longer a strategic threat. Its remnants operated in fragmented defensive roles, and the once prized ability to traverse oceans undetected had vanished. The ocean, which had once been Japan's ally and protector, was now mapped, monitored, and dominated by the Allies, a reminder that control of the seas depended not solely on courage or steel, but on intelligence, innovation, and the ability to anticipate the enemy. The collapse of Japan's underwater campaign was a watershed moment, signaling the end of one kind of warfare and the rise of another, a future where machines, data, and networks could redefine the battlefield as much as bullets, torpedoes, or courage. It was a lesson written not in victories, but in loss. The story of Japan's submarine crews in 1944-1945 is a study in transformation, of the ocean, of warfare, and of human endurance. The waters that had once seemed infinite, protective, and silent became mapped, monitored, and lethal. What had been a theater of stealth and intuition was now dominated by calculation, technology, and relentless observation. The sinking of I-52 and the collapse of Japan's undersea campaign illustrate a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Mastery of a domain is no longer determined solely by courage, skill, or engineering. It is measured by the ability to see, to anticipate, and to innovate faster than the opponent. In the span of a few months, the Allies turned sound into a weapon, invisibility into vulnerability, and the deep ocean, once Japan's ally, into an instrument of control. For the men aboard these submarines, the war beneath the waves was both intensely personal and starkly impersonal. Fear, exhaustion, and honor coexisted in the cramped steel hulls, shaping decisions that would determine life or death. The human story, of isolation, endurance, and quiet terror, is inseparable from the technological and tactical evolution that sealed their fate. And yet, there is a broader lesson. Warfare, like the sea itself, is never static. It shifts, evolves, and often surprises those who cling too tightly to old doctrines. The defeat of Japan's submarine fleet was not a failure of bravery or ingenuity, but a reminder that dominance in any domain is temporary, contingent on adaptation and understanding. In the end, the ocean had not changed. Humanity had. Machines learned, networks expanded, and the invisible eyes of technology reshaped a world that had once belonged to those who trusted in silence. For the Japanese crews, it was a bitter lesson in the limits of mastery. For history, it was a turning point, the moment when the deep sea, long a realm of mystery and fear, became a stage for the unrelenting logic of human invention. The sea had not changed. Humanity had.